Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Tuesday, May 28th, 2024. I am John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Senior editor Seth Mandel. Hi, Seth.
Hi, John.
And media commentary columnist and American Enterprise Institute senior fellow Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
Okay, we got Trump's jury instructions beginning today. We have this controversy over the events involving a targeted strike in Rafah by the IDF, in which shrapnel appears to have set some tents on fire in Rafah and caused the deaths of dozens of Palestinians in said tents. And we have a landmark article. I think it's fair to describe it as a landmark article in Politico, the headline of which is, you know what, I had it here and then my computer closed it off. It was something like, Democrats panic, huge, massive panic over Biden's chances in 2024 election.
It's Dems in, quote, full-blown freakout.
Excuse me, that's so much better than what I just said, right? Full-blown freakout. Now, I will say this about the weekend, and then we can go into the full-blown freakout. So, all last week, because we were observing Shiva, the days of mourning for my wife's father, and then over the weekend, as we sort of emerged from Shiva and went to visit some friends here and there, the number of people, I mean, granted, I'm not in a demographically significant cohort, let's say, but the number of people who were, F it, I'm voting for Trump, or it's over, I'm voting for people who in 2016, if I'd said in 2024, you're going to vote for Trump, would have said, I will never vote for Trump. It will never happen. I will never. That man is a monster. He's a disgrace. He's going to destroy this country. So these are people who are all, Zionist in orientation, very upset with Biden over the last 2 months. So they were very happy with Biden over the first 2 months of the war in Gaza. And this article, combined with the continuation of the polling numbers that suggest that Biden is making absolutely no headway against Trump, though the race is still razor thin. Just from this anecdotal experience, I'm like, man, Biden is in a lot of trouble, because if he's got New York Jews who voted for him 4 years ago walking away from him, granted, on a very singular issue that is not going to motivate other people, but these are people for whom, say, inflation is an inelastic issue. Like it's something they can survive, given their relative affluence, and they already own their homes, so they're not having troubles with, and the price of eggs is not really going to bother them that much. So they are in a different order of issue. But let's say the fact that they are now feeling open to not only saying they're angry at Biden, or they don't like Biden, or they don't know what's going on, but that they've had enough of him and that they are willing to go in this direction, seemed very significant to me as a sort of snapshot in time, as it was Memorial Day weekend. And classically, Memorial Day weekend is the beginning of the summer, and the beginning of the summer of an election year is when the election starts to drill down into people's consciousnesses. Conventions in the summer. Usually people used to say that the election doesn't really begin till Labor Day, which of course is ridiculous, since most elections now take 2 years. So if you're telling me that people aren't paying attention, I don't believe you. They're waiting until after the World Series. Nobody watches the World Series anymore. So that's obviously nonsense. All of those kind of cliches are no longer extant. Anybody else have this experience over the last week of some kind of a shift in the, I don't know what you would call it, the barometric pressure of the election or something like that?
I spent last week teaching a seminar to college students from across the country, really excellent, wonderful kids. And I was struck that for many of them, this is the first election they can vote in, and they are extremely off-put by both candidates. But they don't. What I thought was notable when I sort of asked some follow-up questions about it is that their view of Biden is actually quite strong in the sense of, we don't like this guy. He's too old for the job. Like, he's literally not up to it, and the economy isn't great under him. And they have this kind of general sense of, no, he's not up for another term. When you ask about Trump, it's interesting. What they don't give you is the alarmist message, which of course was threaded throughout anonymous comments in the Politico piece that you mentioned earlier, John. And that's the idea that Trump is a unique threat to democracy. This has been the Democratic Party's message since 2016. It's the message that Biden continues to try to run on. And I think what's interesting is that those younger voters, again, we know that they're fairly fickle when it comes to actually going to the polls. But I think that's a message that the Democratic Party bigwigs think should have some resonance with this younger group. And again, this is a small sample, but it's for kids from across the country. I didn't hear that. I just saw they're fed up with both parties. They're fed up with both candidates, and they're very hungry for an alternative.
I have a kind of anecdotal experience that is maybe worth bringing to bear here, which is that. So I have liberal friends that I have taunted about Biden since the start of his presidency. Good-naturedly, sometimes it gets a little like heated, but it's all just in the spirit of, like, guys.
You're trolling. You're trolling your friends. You're trolling your friends.
Yeah, and it goes in both directions. That stopped. I stopped doing it because they wouldn't push back. They know what's going on. It's not. The fun of it was like sort of overstating things, overstating Biden's faults, and sort of, to needle them. And that no longer holds. There's sort of no way to do that. That's the barometric pressure changing.
So you're like the Bond villain who's like, Mr. Bond, you are no longer fun to banter with as I dangle you over the shark tank.
Right.
Where are your quips now, Mr. Bond? I mean, it is something very okay. So I don't want to make too much of this. The point is, if you look at the Real Clear Politics poll average, Trump's up by 0.2, right, which is certainly not comforting enough, although, for Trump people. Although, according to Democratic professionals and people who, make up these, rules that I'm sure are not rules, because of the natural Republican Electoral College advantage, if Biden doesn't win by at least 3 nationally, he can't possibly win. Again, I love these rules that are sort of stated as though they are as immutable as, as algebra. And of course, every election proves every such thing wrong. But if you do the Electoral College as it stands based on unambiguous polling, each of them has about 212 electoral votes. You need 270 to win. If you eliminate toss-ups, meaning you just assign the electoral vote of a state to the candidate who is ahead, in that, even if it's by 1/10 of a percentage point, Trump has 312 electoral votes. So Biden is in the hole. It has been very hard for Democrats to accept and to be allowed to believe that Biden is in the hole, because it seems disloyal. The White House doesn't want to hear it. They want to say that this is not happening. It's happening. Like, that is immutable. If the election were held today and the polling held up, Trump would win exactly the same number of electoral votes he won, maybe a few more, in 2024 as he won in 2016, exactly the number that Biden won against him in 2020. States that Biden pulled away from Trump would flip back to Trump, and we would be where we were once again. And so some of this is just a kind of concession to reality, the Democratic freakout, because there isn't a lot of time, and impressions are baked, and things do get, impressions do get baked. And how exactly is Joe Biden going to change the American impression of him? Trump seems to have succeeded for whatever reason, or is succeeding for whatever reason, though it's normal to turn this election into a referendum on the incumbent. Obviously, Biden, the Democrats, wanted this to be an election about the challenger and his unique threat to everything that is the American way of life. And that just hasn't stuck.
Because it's an abstraction that would actually have some traction in an economy where people felt a little more secure. And I'm struck still that the Biden campaign keeps sending him out there, or surrogates who say, look at all the things I've done for the middle class. Look at the great things I'm doing. And what I think people are experiencing is continued inflationary costs for the things that they rely and have to buy: food, gas, housing costs. And that message they literally feel slightly gaslit. And we've talked about this a bit. I mean, his message is not resonating with the group that he claims to be helping. So it's not as if he says, I'm trying to just generally improve the economy. He's going to people and saying, you, the middle class, I'm doing all this stuff for you. And the sense is like, yeah, but we're not feeling it. And there's no response to that message. Mr. Empathizer in Chief is just not coming off as empathetic about people's financial struggle right now.
Okay, but I want to talk to you about one of your favorite subjects, Christine, Biden's schedule, because our friend Mark Halperin
Yes.
this morning,
I was going to bring it up, but
is talking about how, as Mark says in his newsletter, Wide World of News, while Twitter remains filled with RNC provided videos suggesting an old man, does this look, he says ironically, like the kind of week ahead schedule that will allay the deep concerns of Democratic donors in Congress that the president looks aged out of it or unable to match Trump at the Vigor game. White House release, May 27, 2024, week ahead guidance for the week of May 28th.
There's nothing for today.
Wednesday.
Right?
There's nothing for Wednesday, May 29th. The president will travel to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Later, the president and the vice president will participate in a campaign event in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. After, the president will depart Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, en route to Wilmington, Delaware. Wilmington, Delaware,
Gotta hit the beach
30 miles from Wilmington is not
Wilmington, not the beach house. Sorry, that's the other house.
Dare you?
Sorry, that's what, there's so many houses to keep track of.
Thursday.
Is that two stops? Two stops, right? On the
Right.
train from Philly to Wilmington?
No, one stop.
No, one stop.
One
stop to Wilmington. And he's not taking the train. He's driving in a motorcade or something, or he's taking a helicopter. He'll be there in 10 minutes. Thursday, May 30th, the president and the first lady will depart Wilmington, Delaware, en route to Rehoboth Beach, Delaware.
There's the beach.
Is there anything else on the schedule that day?
No.
No.
Nope.
Friday, May 31st, the president will depart Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, and return to the White House. After, the president will welcome the Kansas City Chiefs and, of course, its kicker, Harrison Butker, to the White House to celebrate their championship season and victory in Super Bowl 58. After, the president will depart the White House en route to Rehoboth Beach, Delaware.
Nice schedule.
He will have slept in Wilmington on Wednesday. He will have slept in Rehoboth on Thursday. He will sleep in Rehoboth on Friday. He will sleep in Rehoboth on Saturday.
He'll be back on Monday.
And maybe he'll be back on Monday. Yeah. We don't have guidance for that.
Very kind of him. It's very kind of him to make that trip just for Harrison Butker.
I think Harrison Butker, it's amazing they're having the Chiefs at the White House, considering the evil that Harrison Butker said when he said that most women would view marriage and motherhood as the most important jobs of their lives, which is really just such an excruciatingly monstrous thing. I felt like I was back in the 11th century, Christine.
Yes. No, I instantly felt oppressed. It was horrifying. Yeah, it's terrible. I haven't slept well since. No. Let me add something else, though, because this schedule, if he had a popular, vigorous vice president standing in for him as a surrogate, would be great, right? Because he could chill at the beach house, preparing for his upcoming debate, all that nonsense. And she or he would be out there, just charming the socks off the American people. But as several people have pointed out, her popularity is even worse than his, and he is now stuck in this dilemma where the more they send her out, the more clear it becomes that she's way in over her head and she's never going to budge. And they are just in this extremely dysfunctional position right now where, as the Politico piece says, people are starting on their own team are starting to panic. So she has not done much in the past few months or so, even though they've put her out there front and center on a lot of issues, particularly abortion and reproductive rights. She hasn't done much to change people's perception of her either.
All right. So that's now you could say Biden has planned a deliberately light schedule this week because all the news is going to focus on the New York courtroom of Judge Merchan as he delivers the jury instructions today, and the jury begins deliberating in the trial of Donald Trump, where he is accused of falsifying business records, ordinarily a misdemeanor, raised to a felony for reasons that we don't yet know, but I guess we're going to find out in the jury instructions. If that felony is that by hiding the fact that he had had an affair with Stormy Daniels, and because the National Enquirer had done the catch and kill on stories about Trump's infidelities, that he thereby stole the 2016 election in some fashion or other. What are we to make of the idea that a jury will convict on that basis? It strikes me, and I am somebody who, it strikes me that Trump can kind of run on that for 5 months. Meanwhile, next week or this week, the trial of Hunter Biden begins in California. So, Abe, what do you think?
Well, I think the salient point here regarding Hunter is pretty specific in that Joe Biden, if you're talking about sort of covering up scandal in advance of an election, Joe Biden blatantly lied about Hunter's laptop in the run-up to the 2020 election, lied to the American people. That's not even contested. I mean, I think CNN has basically said as much, has replayed the one of the Trump Biden debates from that election, and played Trump's litany of accusations at Joe Biden, where Joe Biden says, "I have no idea what you're talking about. This is all disinformation." And CNN stopped the tape and said, "No, so Trump was basically right, wasn't he?" And all this stuff. So there's that.
Right. But the point is, I don't actually think that if you look back and you thought about everything and you said Hunter Biden did thus and that, and he was like influence peddling and whatever, and that had been accepted, that it would actually have made a difference in the election. But I don't know that for a fact. I think I pretty much know for a fact that everybody knew that Trump was a horrible and disgusting sleaze by the time the election of 2016 had taken place. So we didn't know about Stormy Daniels, but we knew about the Access Hollywood tape. We knew there were rumors about other women and all of that. That wasn't a big deal, and the American people voted him president. So what we do have is evidence that Trump can survive a bimbo eruption, as what was that woman's name who was played by Kathy Bates in Primary Colors, as his consigliere, as his Arkansas consigliere called the job of suppressing the Clinton women. We know that Trump can survive. We don't actually know for a fact that Biden would have survived a really deep late dive into Hunter's laptop by the mainstream media had they accepted the reality of its existence and then plunged into serious investigative reporting of its contents. I suspect the answer is that would not have made a material difference, but again, we don't know. But
it might now. Sure. It might now, because he ran before on integrity and empathy and I'm not Trump, right? Basically, he ran on I'm not Trump. But the understanding was that I'm a person of integrity and empathy, and so we want the opposite of that because that's chaos and I'm order. Well, the difference now is that the mainstream media is not doing a service to Joe Biden by continuing to cover him cover for him on the Hunter stuff. Look, one thing he did have time to do recently is go visit his former daughter-in-law. And now this was the media that picked up on this story. She's about to testify in Hunter's trial, right? In the next few days. And the media covered this as, how dare you even mention this? He's visiting someone who lost a spouse. They have a whole way of covering for this, and that might very well be true. I am not questioning what his motives are. But if you put an R next to this guy's name, or it was Donald Trump visiting a daughter-in-law who was about to testify against, a family member in a trial, this would be framed very differently. And we're seeing a trickling out. Now, this is starting in the tabloids.
By the way, can I just interrupt for a second? Because at least in The Godfather Part 2, when the disturbing witness played by Michael Vigazzo, Frankie Five Angels, had to be convinced to lie on the stand and then commit suicide. Michael didn't go to talk to Frankie Five Angels.
You sent someone to do that.
He sent Tom Hagen to talk to Frankie Five Angels.
Right.
Biden went himself to talk to Hallie.
Right.
So,
and we don't know what this was about.
No, but I couldn't. I'm sorry.
No. Yeah, it's a notable
if there's a Godfather analogy, I got to make it. It's an autonomic response.
Totally allowed.
Okay.
But there is also this story in the Daily Mail, again, it's a tabloid, but this is often where things begin and then trickle down, about, again, going to the Chinese deal making with Hunter and Joe, all to Abe's earlier point, stuff that Joe Biden has changed his message subtly and now very dramatically over the last few years about whether or not he knew, but he didn't financially benefit. We didn't know it was this meeting. So the story, the integrity, authenticity point, which Joe Biden successfully ran on before, is really now being questioned. Now, whether or not these stories will pan out, certainly we don't know if the mainstream media will pick them up and follow them. There is questioning in people's minds now about those dealings, as there should be, because the Biden family has profited enormously from Joe Biden's public service. And you can debate whether that is illegal. And certainly, there are going to be debates about Hunter Biden's legal and illegal activities. But it's the sort of ethical cloud that now attaches to him that, again, doesn't to Trump, because as you said, John, we kind of knew what we were getting with Trump.
And also, I think there's something to the fact that the American people probably don't really truly understand all of the charges in both cases. I don't think that it's so clear to people who just pay casual attention to the news what exactly it means that Hunter Biden did this and Donald Trump did this, and some of these, some of the foreign influence, the influence peddling stuff. It's all I think Trump benefits to some extent from the murkiness of it. I think Biden does too, but only to the point where people go, they're both kind of doing weird things. I don't really get it. I don't really think either of them is a monster because of that. But this was a mistake I thought the trial with Trump just made, which is, if you ask anybody, if you go on the street, if you do a Jay Leno man on the street thing and you ask somebody, what is the specific crime that Donald Trump may or may not be found guilty of this week? I think people have a hard time explaining it. They may say, he paid hush money, but that's not, hush money isn't a crime, right? I mean, there's a camp. Did he use campaign funds? Did he do this? Did he lie? Whatever. There's no, you're not going to have people out on the street going.
The crime is he didn't use campaign funds, by the way. That's the joke, right?
I don't know that the jury would be able to answer the question.
Right.
Even
after the instructions. Right. Okay.
Right. I think that's right. I think the judge has made clear. Yeah. Normally, in a case like this, you'd have instructions that the jury would probably not find him guilty. I think in this case, the judge has made clear. But I think that what they did was they concentrated the whole trial on things we already knew, and so there was this the media watching it were doing all this Yas Queen stuff, with Stormy Daniels, she said that about him and she said this about him, and it's and there were these sort of Me Too edged stories where they were this is Stormy Daniels speaks for all women who were mistreated, this and that,
Yes, the power slut branding was really interesting, right?
It was all along this, this stuff that they just cheered, but it wasn't evidence. It was just stuff that made them happy to hear, and I think it warped their sense of what the public understood about the case, because it was more of stuff that they agree with them about Trump, that he, it was like Trump is a dirtbag, and I think that they agreed with that, but they didn't really get what all the fuss was about. And so that, I think, benefits them also.
Look, two things benefit them. One is that the Biden Hunter trial, however it comes out, has some effect of negating the accusation that Trump is uniquely corrupt. Even if Hunter is innocent of everything, I can't remember what he's on trial for, a gun thing. I mean, whatever.
Guns, drugs, lying on government documents. There's a list.
Yeah. Right. Okay.
Tax evasion.
I believe the charges are sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Fair enough. So he's acquitted. He's convicted. Things got serious enough that the president's son was brought to trial. There are deeper questions about what's on the laptop and whether they demonstrate that Biden materially benefited from Hunter's business practices and used his position to benefit. That doesn't even matter. Like that starts getting into the weeds. It's just like Trump's no angel and Biden's no angel. And that's a pretty effective negating of a clear Biden advantage in 2020, right? That he can no longer play with. The other part is the media coverage that Seth mentioned, and again, I'm going to make a bizarre analogy to an episode of Monty Python's Flying Circus, where John Cleese shows up at the door of this like suburban couple and says, "Would you like a documentary?" And they're like, "Sure." He walks in, he like has a little fake television, and he's in the screen in their house, and he's talking about a mollusk and the life of a mollusk and what goes on in the life of a mollusk. And they're like, "This is boring. Let's change the channel." And then he starts in on the sex life of the mollusk and how the mollusk actually rapes other mollusks and, does this little bugger is always on the job. And then they're like, "This is fantastic." That is MSNBC in a nutshell. It's like, it doesn't matter. There's a trial. You're supposed to prove that Trump was guilty. But as long as Stormy Daniels is talking about how Trump raped her, which is an entirely new allegation, and she fainted on the bed and she didn't know what had happened to her, and all of this, somebody who has been in 250 pornographic films in which she has therefore had sex paid for money on screen with other people, suddenly is like, "I don't know, I was overpowered by this giant man, the billionaire." That as long as she was talking, they're like, "Oh, this is the best thing ever. Let's have more. We're going to do 6 hours today on Stormy Daniels," with like former U.S. attorneys going, "She's a very credible witness." Come, like, how badly do you have to sell your soul to the devil to say that a porn star saying that she was mishandled sexually by somebody is a really good witness? And having been somebody who actually prosecuted hundreds of people and would never have taken this case in a million years had you been the sitting U.S. attorney or district attorney of New York at the time. But the salaciousness that they were able to introduce into trial, that was supposed to be really bad for Trump. Why do they think that this is bad for Trump? This is what he has survived. This was the one thing he proved that he could survive, was the idea that he was a sexual sleaze. He got elected president less than a month after he was talking about grabbing women by the hoo-ha, right? So it's like they live in a world in which it doesn't matter what's actually politically helpful to them as long as they can hear about the mollusk, getting it on with the other mollusk. That's all they need.
That tape, by the way, that was the Access Hollywood tape, that was the moment that I think everybody should have learned this lesson and moved on from it. And that was 8 years ago, which is that, I remember being around people who were not easily shocked by the things that Trump said by that point. And when that video came out, some of these people's reaction was, "Oh boy, Like
But
that was the Access Hollywood tape was bad, and it didn't kill him. And so I think that was the moment 8 years ago they should have realized that's not the harpoon that's going to get the whale. If the Access Hollywood tape did.
It's the sort of the mirror image of what the Jeremiah Wright tape was for Barack Obama, right? When that came out, you're like, oh, how on earth do you get out of this? How do you get? And then you realize, oh, he's actually immune on that front. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. No, I mean, so it is, but they don't care, is my point. The anti-Trumpiest of anti-Trumpy people have an inexhaustible appetite for, hey, you know what I heard today? Trump is really bad. Like, don't they get bored? It's like the Seinfeld cast sitting in the jail cell for a year going over every joke that they said for the last 9 years. How are they not going crazy with boredom? I mean, they're saying the same things over and over and over and over again. Now, we do a 5-day-a-week podcast. We repeat ourselves, certainly, but there is a kind of, quality to this. Like,
also, the theater of the Trump trial from their perspective was actually very boring in the sense that, so there were no cameras. So every time you turn on the news, there's a bunch of sketches, right? There's a bunch of sketch bad, sketch artist renderings and commentary. And then the one live dynamic part of the day for Trump was when he comes out and gives his spiel afterward. And that was good for him.
Also, you notice there was this whole thing where it was like when you have a baby and you're very aware because you need the baby to nap and the baby's off in the room and you're like, everybody wants babies, and then it's like, it appears his eyes are starting to close. Did you not, like Trump, like whoever was in the courtroom, the reporters of the courtroom, he's slumping a little. I think he's maybe fallen asleep. He's asleep in the courtroom. Like, why does that matter? You know why it matters? Because they think, oh, they called Biden Sleepy Joe. Well, Trump is falling asleep in the courtroom. Like, are you people crazy? Like, I guess it's a funny detail whether or not he's like a man who was bored by listening to the trial proceedings. But what does that matter? We're talking about who's going to win the presidency of the United States. It's just very interesting and amusing to me. Whatever happens now is going to happen because all of that stuff is over. Okay, so now we're going to move from the ridiculous to the not so ridiculous. Israel is now pretty much engaged in its offensive in Rafah, which is not looking like the prior offensive in which, just like 100,000 Israelis like moved into Gaza. They've been spending a week doing limited operations. Now, today, there are reports that tanks are now in the center of Rafah, and after a missile barrage, maybe the last missiles that they have, right, was launched from Rafah at Tel Aviv, and shrapnel injured somebody in Beersheba. So they fired off 200 rockets or something like that from Rafah, and Israel responded by this targeted strike on 2 Hamas leaders. And then shrapnel, apparently from that targeted strike, bounced off onto a tent colony, and a couple dozen people were killed. Remember, what has happened over the last 3 weeks is that Israel has moved almost 1 million people out of Rafah in accord with U.S. demands that 1 million people be moved out of Rafah. And so it's on. And now the question is, what's going to be said about it while it's on?
Well, one thing we shouldn't have to be said, but it must be said every time there is a strike and there are, again, tragic civilian casualties. Hamas surrounds itself with civilians deliberately as part of its strategy to win the propaganda war, which it clearly is. If you look at how all of the stories this morning were framed with regard to what happened in Rafah, they did take out 2 terrorists. 2 Hamas terrorists were taken out. But because those terrorists surround themselves with women and children and hostages, there will be more of these deaths. And I think Israel has to understandably, they immediately launched an investigation into what happened. They do that every time. We've talked about how legalistically careful they are before, during, and after these strikes, but it will continue to happen. And that is on Hamas, because Hamas surrounds itself with civilians.
Particularly here, where this strike was in response to the firing off of 300 missiles. Like, they went after
Israeli
guys,
civilians,
the
yes.
Israeli civilian, like, fired at. So the Israeli, this specific thing that happened was in response to a Hamas aggression.
Hamas aggression, which violates international law, which, again, this doesn't get mentioned.
Right. So I am.
The Israeli strike was on the nose. That's the other thing, right? The Israeli strike was on the nose. So if there are civilians, that's the other point that Christine was making about Hamas hiding among civilians. I mean, this was not an errant strike. This was like the strike knocked on the front door and walked in and got its guys. And still all this other stuff happened because 2 Hamas leaders are so close to where these civilian tents are. That's not the fault of the people in the tents, obviously, but I'm just saying the point about Hamas is that that's how close they can be, is that you can literally, hit that targeted strike. There's nothing more, you can't get more targeted than that particular strike. And, a piece of shrapnel can hit a truck with some rockets on it and, all these things, what they're among. But I thought the key for me was, and maybe it's because Biden is spending all this time at Rehoboth Beach or something and is just, kind of out of it. But the Biden administration didn't respond to this one the way they have responded in the past. And I think that is telling, because this was designed this was the sort of thing that would get the outrage if the Biden administration were looking for a pretense to be outraged, right? Obviously the pictures were horrible. People died in a fire. This was a terrible thing with terrible scenes. And so, it's kind of like when someone showed Donald Trump pictures of those Syrian kids and then he was like, all right, let's strike Assad. It was the sort of thing that plucks at you. But they didn't, I don't want to say take the bait, because it's something that actually happened, but they didn't use that as a pretense to hit Israel hard. And I think that some of that is reality setting in, right? There appear to be parts of the pier floating away in Gaza. Like, I think that there's some of this is like the reality setting in of how difficult it is to do anything in a war zone with that kind of precision, and that the type of things that the Americans have been yelling at the Israelis to do, they now realize they're probably doing everything they can in order to do those things, and and not before. And I think that there's just this sort of almost like resignation, like, all right, I mean, what are you going to do sort of attitude, which was not their attitude last time.
And I think the U.S. in its effort to stay Israel's hand in Rafah here has created a whole slew of problems for itself. Not just the breaking up pier and the fact that aid isn't getting through, but you have now the International Criminal Court, a kind of Frankenstein's monster that I think U.S. posture fed. You have European nations recognizing a Palestinian state while Hamas is still in charge. They've got to be more careful now. Like this has kind of gotten away from them, and all of it, by the way, none of it has resulted in Israel not going into Rafah.
I mean, I think a lot of it did result in Israel delaying going into Rafah. I think the last 3 months have been a very complicated political maneuvering problem, and I think that Israel is still on its back hind legs or not quite sure how to respond, because I think that Benjamin Netanyahu responded badly to this event. He said it was a tragic mishap or a tragic mistake, and they're investigating it. And Christine, you praise that. The simple fact of the matter is, they went and they struck people. There were these tents. They were next to a gas tank. A piece of shrapnel hit the gas tank. The gas tank exploded, and the tents were near the gas tank. If I were, maybe you could call that a tragic mishap. The problem is that Bibi, by saying this, has potentially established the idea that any civilian death in Rafah going forward is a tragedy for which Israel bears some kind of responsibility. And Israel, not only does Israel bear no moral responsibility for any single death in Gaza, period, because this is a war that was started, everything was at peace, and where everything was basically at status quo before October 7th. The hostilities were inaugurated, as a surprise attack on Israel, which has had to respond. The idea that, therefore, it is morally obligated to protect the lives of the civilians who elected the government that attacked them, even if that election took place 18 years ago, and there hasn't been another one since. Nonetheless, I think that was a tactical mistake on his part. I'm not quite sure who he was doing it for. And the problem is that while America is okay today and saying things, and we're now at the point where we expect so little that we're like, because America didn't say Israel's committed a war crime in Gaza, we're supposed to now dance up and down and say they've really learned something new.
But what should Bibi have said instead?
He should have said, we're still investigating. It appears that, in the fog of war, something happened, but not say that it was a mishap. I mean, even if it was a mishap, obviously it's a mishap because it happened and you didn't want it to happen. So it was, unnecessary. But these things happen in war on a daily basis. And by the way, this may be the reason, I think you both alluded to this, why America needs to tread carefully here, because predicates can be established here where nobody can do anything because other bad things might happen. We have alluded to the fact, and people have said many times, that in trying to defeat ISIS in Mosul and successfully defeating ISIS in Mosul, America launched strikes that killed 11,000 Iraqis, for which now, if you start down this road, America could, the International Court of Justice or Criminal Court or whatever, people can start going after America for doing things that America feels is in their national interest. And you better not establish predicates that your body can't cash. Like, this is not a good idea to create rules of war that are unattainable when you are one of the countries in the world that sometimes has to use aggressive military tactics to forestall worse things from happening.
And it's a reminder of when it happened to them, right? Because we all remember in the waning years of the Bush administration, there were judges in Spain who were like, if John Bolton comes to Spain, we're going to arrest him. There were indictments in absentia, like written out in one of them. The Spanish court was the most famous one, but throughout Europe there were like these guys are war criminals that are not my country. So I think the United States remembers that was when it got a taste of the problems that Israel has, which is where people do try to encourage arresting them wherever they go, and that was something that U.S. officials had to deal with personally. I mean, it was like, a Spanish judge says like, hey, arrest the vice president of the United States or something like that.
Well, remember there was an arrest warrant for Henry Kissinger out of The Hague 40 years after he was Secretary of State, or 30 years or 35 years or something like that. So there are no statutes of limitations on this completely unlawful, illegitimate, and nonsense court. They can say anything. They could indict Tony Blinken 35 years from now for having a hangnail. I mean, that's where you don't want to legitimize forces that are pretty much arrayed against you, and you are innocent. So, yeah, don't think that they're just going to come after people you don't like. They're going to come after you too. That's why you try to follow established principles that apply to everybody at the same time, or you're going to get screwed by it yourself later. Seth, I want to talk to you about a blog post you put up at an event that happened in the Friday or whatever, with our the member of Congress from Gaza and the West Bank, and from the terrorist organizations there too, Rashida Tlaib.
Rashida Tlaib was the surprise guest at the People's Conference for Palestine, which was held in Detroit over the weekend. It was a 3-day conference, and it's mainly organized by the Palestinian Youth Movement, which is an organization that has a 501c designation, but is therefore it's murky. But the dark money that we've spoken about in the past of these major donor organization trickles down to organizations like the Palestinian Youth Movement too. The conference was endorsed and promoted ahead of time by major figures in the PFLP, which is the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is sort of throwback when you say that. People, we don't have the Popular Fronts much anymore, but this is actually a really important organization, terrorist organization. It is on the U.S. list of designated foreign terrorist organization that has been for probably 25 or 30 years now, I would think. It is, and so two major members of the PFLP endorsed and promoted the conference, including one who was a founder, and then a few of them appeared at the conference. One of them is Wissam Rafidi, who appeared remote, but was at this conference. He is a PFLP guy, a longtime member. So there were actual members of a designated terrorist organization featured on the program. If you picked up the program for this conference before the conference started, it was not a surprise that Wissam Rafidi was going to be there. They were advertising this, and the one of the major speeches, really probably the keynote, was Sanaa Daka, who is the wife of a PFLP terrorist who died, I think, just last month in an Israeli prison of illness. But he commanded a PFLP cell that kidnapped and horrifically tortured and murdered Moshe Tamam in 1984, an Israeli, I think it was an IDF reservist. But so these are the people who were literally at the conference and advertised to be at the conference. There was an art exhibit on Layla Khaled, who was a terrorist who was involved in 2 hijackings. And then the big surprise was that Rashida Tlaib was there on the final day and gave a rip-roaring speech about how the president is a genocidaire and Bibi Netanyahu is a genocidal maniac. I think she used that. She has begun using that phrase more and more often. So this was not like, there's some murky ties here. I'm not sure this organization is the successor organization to this organization. This is the PFLP is there. Rashida Tlaib was there, and they all spoke together, and they all cheered together, and they all said the same things. And the other thing about the PFLP is just that it was, I had mentioned this in my essay in the March issue, I think it was, that about the history of the hostage deals, Israeli hostage deals. The PFLP was an originator in this model of kidnapping Israelis and extorting them for lopsided deals. And so the PFLP really kind of paved the road, even though it was a long road, the road to October 7th and the model of the conflict where Hamas would build an underground Gaza, a second Gaza underground, the infrastructure for the main purpose of taking and holding hostages. All that ground was plowed by the PFLP years ago. So I think it's significant that they have this, that they have this relevance to the specific kind of conflict we're having now. And Rashida Tlaib, sitting U.S. Congresswoman, shows up and whoops along with the crowd.
So two questions raise themselves. One of which is, I believe that it is a crime to provide material support for a designated terrorist organization in the United States. Now,
yes, it is.
Sitting members of Congress have an exemption that right now my brain is not allowing me to remember the name of which, but essentially a kind of amnesty for speech. Like they're allowed to say whatever it is they want to say. The speech immunity or something, speech and debate clause or something. And so it may well be that she cannot be prosecuted for giving a speech somewhere, because if that speech were being delivered in some sense as part of her official duties as a member of Congress. But she did, as you say, cross a bright red line, which isn't just moral, it is practical. The PFLP is recognized as a designated terrorist organization. There are criminal sanctions in the United States for providing material support for a designated terrorist organization if the ties between the organization that sponsored this event and the PFLP are sufficiently real. That is a thing. I don't know where we go from that. I do know that, if a prosecutor can indict a ham sandwich, who knows who could indict what for whom, where. And I don't think this story is anywhere near over yet. Want to make a second point, not that I'm getting all, biblical and admonitory here, since I did a whole thing last week about Psalm 94. But it was interesting this weekend. Every Shabbat, you read a passage from the Torah. You go through the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, throughout the year. And this week's Torah Parsha is the source of the idea which is idea not in the Torah, but post-biblical, as they say, that Jews must ransom for hostages. There's a passage in it all having to do with indentured servitude and slavery. And the idea is that if a Jew becomes the indentured servant or slave to a Gentile, and by the way, that's something that people used to do to themselves as a form of basically bankruptcy. Like they would say, okay, I can't pay you back. I got no money. I'll be your slave. I mean, this is a real thing. And then all slaves then get released every 49 years, according to the laws of the Bible. But there is this passage that says a relative of a Jew must do everything in his power to secure the release of the indentured servant, meaning pay his debt, really, or find a way to pay his debt. And it's this passage that led to the idea that the Jewish communities post-exile actually were obliged to ransom for hostages, and that led to the ruling in the mid 70s by the leading Sephardic rabbi, the great scholar Ovadia Yosef, who ruled that it was, even though it was dangerous for Israel, that Israel could in fact ransom and maybe was obliged to ransom hostages. At the time of the seizure of the Entebbe plane, this question then arose. It didn't actually have to be activated because the Israelis rescued the hostages without paying ransom. And that, when he released that in 1977, that was actually when the PFLP, which was one of the originators of the Entebbe raid, we don't know if they understood, who knows who knew what. We know that Yahya Sinwar of Hamas is uncommonly literate in Israeli, Hebrew speaker, and uncommonly literate in internal Israeli politics. But that was the moment. So Rashida Tlaib is participating in a tribute moment to somebody who created the crisis of hostage taking that is one of the things that is perpetuating the war in Gaza, and she is on the side of the hostage takers. She is on the side of those who are doing this. She is a sitting U.S. congressman. The word, there's no word in the vocabulary to describe the disgracefulness of this behavior. I don't even know what you would call it.
She also mocked the fact that she'd been censored before by her colleagues in Congress for her anti-Semitic remarks and laughed about it. I mean, laughed about it. The contempt for her own institution, setting aside the material support for terrorist organization and as you say, John, siding it with the hostage takers. Americans still held hostage. She's siding with the people who have taken Americans hostage while laughing contemptuously at the idea that she can be censured by her own colleagues. So I think that's also her contempt for her institution is one of the reasons why Congress is in disarray.
Right. I mean,
Speaking of
there's American
sorry.
hostages, right? There's American hostages still
There are
in
five
Gaza.
American hostages, right?
And a founding member of PFLP is promoting the conference and endorsing the conference before it happens. Now, if we stop there, basic decency would say, or even just rationality would say, you don't go storming into that conference, hollering and cheering, right? I mean, there are 5 American hostages. And so that enough pre-conference before you even get to the things that people say at the conference. Now, the other thing about the conference is that it was hugely anti-American. And there were several speakers who said things like, it connected it all to the history of American colonial violence and that's the system that has to be dismantled. And this was all part of the same conference that she was so happy to be there for. There's a Palestinian, a well-known Palestinian legislator, Mustafa Barghouti, who's a cousin of the famous Marwan Barghouti, who's Mahmoud Abbas's rival. Mustafa Barghouti was there also via Zoom because he was complaining he can't get a visa to travel to the United States. Why does one think that might be? Now, he suggested that he said, I thought it was Trump. I assumed Trump was the problem, but then it turns out that Joe Biden isn't much different. I mean, he said this to the crowd. So, Joe Biden doesn't want this guy in the country either, but also this conference is full of people saying things like, Joe Biden is no different than Donald Trump. Joe Biden is collaborating with a genocidal maniac. Joe Biden this, Joe Biden that.
Tlaib herself said, "We are not going to forget what Joe Biden has done here in November." What's so interesting to me about this is that Tlaib is not saying, "Okay, look, I'm going to be clever about my anti-Israel animus and my anti-Semitism. I'm going to be nuanced. I'm going to dog whistle my way through this. I'm going to walk the line." She is saying, as Seth's piece echoes, I am going to cross bright red lines again and again. I'm going to be explosive about this. Why? Because she thinks that on balance, in the end, the cause will benefit. She thinks if she pushes this as hard as she can push it, even if it goes now to, if there's some sort of hearing, if there's some sort of push to get her out, if there's talk of treason, whatever comes of it, she thinks can be shaped to benefit the cause.
Well, and she did fundraising. Right. She sends out a fundraising email anytime she's criticized. So, of course, it does financially benefit her reelection campaign.
Absolutely. Okay. And speaking of evil of the sort that Rashida Tlaib practices, our commentary recommends, I think, is a joint recommendation, at least from Abe and me, but I think also from Christine, returning for its 4th and supposedly final season, although it is exploded off of Paramount Plus onto Netflix as a big hit. And so Netflix likes to make new seasons of shows that have been canceled by other cable channels, and maybe this will happen with this, is the show called Evil, which we talked about before, which is one of the most original television programs made in the last 30 years. It is it's a team investigating possible demonic cases of demonic possession. One, a would-be priest who becomes a priest in the course of the show. One, a psychologist. And one, the skeptical scientist who can always prove when someone is using a deep fake or or an internet trick to make it appear as though there are demons. And the show is macabre. It is extraordinarily funny. It's like almost like a burlesque of Rosemary's Baby a little bit. And it is building to as the fourth season begins, it is building to a climax where 38 days from the beginning of the first episode, or whatever the story is in the episode, something really, really, really bad is going to happen on the planet Earth. And all
those
kinds
of us
things
raised
are
Christian
gathering.
fundamentalists are trained
You're
to see
prepared.
all the signs.
Yes,
We know what's
yes.
coming.
Yes. Anyway, it is, I don't know how to describe it. It's a show. It is delightful in a very peculiar way. It's creepy. It's scary. It is. I don't know if it's actually openly scary. I'm not sure, but it's tense. There are like very
Occasional
tense
jump scares. Yeah.
and
There's
but I don't know anything that's ever been like.
And the characters are lovable, consistently
Yes,
lovable.
the characters are incredibly lovable. The shrink who has 4 kids and a husband who is a mountaineer who takes people on mountain tours of Everest, played by an amazing Dutch actress named Katja Hebbers, who didn't learn English till she was 25 and speaks unaccented English, and plausibly is the daughter of Christine Lottie, who plays her wild former hippie mother who gets involved with the person who is essentially running Demon City, New York, who is played by Michael Emerson, who people remember from Lost.
And you know what else I like about the show? And I haven't yet seen the current season. I'm catching up. I'm going back and watching all of it over again. It adds complications each episode that don't just vanish into nowhere. If they get woven into the larger story of what's happening.
Right. So it's not doing the Lost thing.
Right.
It's not overcomplicating itself and then dropping things out of nowhere. And there is a beautiful performance by this guy, Mike Coulter.
I was just going to say, you got to give Mike Coulter a shout out, because the struggle that he goes through over season by season as becoming a priest is just wonderful. Who
is really, really remarkable. But there is a beautiful performance in it by Andrea Martin, whom people remember 40, 50 years ago from SCTV, who has largely become a sort of character stage actress. She was the aunt in My Big Fat Greek Wedding, which a lot of people may have seen. And she plays a nun who seems to be the only genuine person of deep, devout Catholic faith, without irony or anything, who believes in demons, fights demons. We see her fighting demons. She has a calm and a control and a containment. It's a remarkable piece of acting. It's a great show. It's on Paramount Plus. I strongly recommend it, and it's going week by week, by the way. So if you're going to follow Abe's thing and you decide you want to catch up, I think it's 8 episodes a season. So it's not like it's not like you have to, catching up will take you 100 hours. If you want to do it that way, they're only releasing it week by week. So only the first episode came out, I think, on Thursday or Wednesday or something like that. But I have spent this entire year caring about nothing, caring about no movie, has done anything for me for 5 months. TV is like, all this. I'm really happy to see this back. So that's Evil on Paramount Plus, and we'll be back tomorrow. Also for Abe, Seth, and Christine, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.